Okay, great. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here to present this joint work with Jongrim and Ayhan, who's hiding somewhere, who will be back. So yesterday, Matteo started off this conference with this comment how his work on geoeconomics has suddenly become more interesting and relevant. And the same can be said to this. Nothing like the historically large tariff increase to have us all start to think about the trade-offs for monetary policy around activity, inflation, and prices. So what motivated this paper, though, was not foresight of what was going to happen with tariff policy, but it was actually a comment that Philip Lane, chief economist at the ECB, made at the Sintra conference last year. There we go. Okay. Where Philip asked this question is, how have the trade-offs facing central banks changed over time? Why do the trade-offs around inflation and activity vary across countries given an inflation shock, as just happened a couple of years ago? And in particular, he's interested in the trade-offs around tightening strategies, when central banks do often face a trade-off of reducing inflation and what's the hit to activity. And when I use the word activity today, I mean hit to the labor market as well as to GDP growth and other broader measures of activity. So huge question. Also a huge literature on this. Is anyone in this room on a rainy Friday morning at an NBER macro annual? I'm going to assume you know this literature. Many of you contributed to it. But there's this huge literature on Phillips curve, sacrifice ratios, what affects trade-offs around inflation and activity in the Phillips curve, sacrifice ratios, et cetera. So I'm not going to summarize that literature. I assume if you're here, you know this literature. But what's really interesting is if you go back and read through this huge literature, lots of approaches, lots of authors, what you realize is there's not a lot of focus on the impact on the price level when you adjust to shocks. People focus on getting inflation back to target, but again, not a lot of focus on what happens to prices in between. So that's what we hope to do in this paper. A lot of this work does focus on the accumulated change in output gaps, but not the accumulated change in inflation rates, i.e. the change in the price level. So that is, again, what we want to highlight, that should be part of the discussion of the trade-offs facing central banks, because as we all know, if you, say, start at 2% inflation, you get some sort of shock, and then you end up at 2% inflation, there can be very different paths to get from point A to point B with very different longer-term effects on the price level. So this focus on the price level also links nicely to some really nice new veins of literature over the past couple of years. There's some great work using really detailed information on household surveys, which has given us a better understanding of how households think about inflation, and they do not like hits to the price level and their purchasing power. They think it's unfair. We've also had a nice series of papers that look at the nonlinear effects of price shocks. So we've got a better understanding of how large price shocks can have more longer lasting effects on the wage and price setting process. For example, firms that adjust prices more often, people pay more attention to inflation, it can affect the inflation anchor. And then there's also been a little bit of work, and my guess is there's about to be a lot more, on how periods of elevated inflation can affect voters and vote outcomes. So a lot of big issues. What do we do in this paper? The paper is basically divided into 4 sections. The first section uses a new approach to define a series of rate cycles. So similar to in business cycles, we have periods of expansion and contraction. We define a period of rate cycles that consists of tightening and easing phases for central banks. We do this for 24 economies, for just advanced economies, for 55 years through the end of last year. Then we take these neat rate cycles where we've identified periods of tightening and easing of monetary policy, and you can look at all sorts of great statistics. What were different central bank strategies for tightening and easing during these periods? What happened to macroeconomic variables? Then this third section of the paper finally uses these pieces to try to answer our key question, which is how have the trade-offs for central banks changed over time? And why do they vary across countries? We'll look at a bunch of macro variables to understand these trade-offs. And then we probably could have stopped the paper there, but we couldn't resist doing one more stage, which is some sort of rough analysis of why have these trade-offs changed over time. Why do central banks face harder trade-offs between activity and inflation versus others? And we're going to focus on the role of different central bank strategies, how central bank decisions can in turn affect the trade-offs between inflation and unemployment. We do that with some super simple regressions and also some simulations using the Fed's Forbes model. So what do we find? Lots of cool results. This is one of those papers, if you like macro data and looking at patterns and understanding macro history, there's just a ton you can look at. But let me just highlight a few of the ones that we found more interesting and relevant to the sort of key takeaways. First, when you look at the characteristics of tightening and easing cycles over time, you find that there has rate cycles have become more muted until the post-pandemic tightening period, and then central banks were unusually aggressive in the tightening strategies they followed. And this led to there was some very unusual macro patterns after the pandemic, very sharp reduction in inflation with almost no output losses, historically low output losses for a tightening phase, which led to record low sacrifice ratios in most countries. But this also corresponded to the largest increase in the price level that we've seen since the 1980s, and in some countries since even earlier. Basically, what happened after the pandemic when inflation hit, we had most of the adjustment happen through prices, almost no adjustment happening through activity in the labor market. So a very different pattern than we've seen recently. And then what explains that? A lot of factors, but we focus on one in particular, and we find evidence that the strategies chosen by central banks after the pandemic did contribute to this unusual pattern of adjustment. In particular, the fact that central banks waited to start raising interest rates, were slow, and then they hiked more aggressively, combined with pre-existing credibility, can explain this unusual set of macro outcomes. As well as obviously other factors. This is a lot of implications for thinking about central bank strategy going forward and also thinking about framework reviews. Hopefully there'll be time to talk about that at the end or in discussion. But the key takeaway we hope you bring from this is that we should be talking about and thinking about more the price level when looking at different strategies for central banks. Not just, does inflation eventually get back to 2%? How you get there should be part of the discussion. But that does not mean that we are suggesting we should shift to price level targeting. There are times there's big shocks. The main part of the adjustment has to come through the price level. You can think of a timely situation around that today. But we do have some more concrete ideas of how you can incorporate this into the discussion without formal price level targeting. Okay, so that's the paper. There's a lot in there. In the interest of time, what I'm going to do is just give you a sample of some of the results from the first sections, so you know what's in there, and hopefully it's a resource for future work, and then focus more on the results on trade-offs for central banks. So first section of the paper is an update of a paper we did for Central last summer, which is defining rate cycles. And again, basically what we do is we go to the business cycle literature, a lot of work on how you define business cycles and booms and busts. We take a popular algorithm, the BBQ algorithm, and you apply this to movements in policy interest rates to define tightening and easing phases for central banks. Just applying the algorithm doesn't quite work though, because especially a lot of different technicalities, but the big one is there is this long period where interest rates were at lower bounds and they didn't move. And the main instruments for monetary policy were balance sheet adjustment. So we also bring that into the analysis. And that then gives us, and we do this for 24 advanced economies, 55 years. We look at individual Euro countries until the ECB was created and then have that as one entity. Put it all together, we get this neat database of rate cycles, 223 distinct easing and tightening phases for advanced economies. And again, they can answer a ton of questions with this. So hopefully, if any of you are looking at related work, you can use this database of rate cycles. And here's just a sample of what comes out. This is what comes out for the US. We do this for each of our 24 economies. The black is policy interest rates in the US. Purple and red are the start of easing and tightening phases, respectively. Orange and blue are the start of big QE and QT programs. Lots you can say, but the main thing, or one point I want to make, is what's neat about this algorithm is the way monetary policy has been done has changed quite quite dramatically over since 1970. There's different frameworks, different tools, different variables you focus on. Even the policy interest rate has changed, and that's just for one country. And then to do this across countries is tricky. But what's really nice about this algorithm, it's not perfect, but this approach we've developed works really well across different regimes and ways of doing monetary policy. And you can sort of see that very different use of the policy rate, but yet the algorithm does a good job identifying the start and end of easing and tightening cycles despite all these changes across time and variance across countries. Okay, so then we've got this great database of rate cycles. Next, we can then look at all sorts of patterns during these rate cycles. So you can look at things, all sorts of statistics on central bank strategies during tightening and easing cycles. We look at some statistics that are typical in the business cycle literature, duration, amplitude, plus a set of new stuff that you look at for interest rates, like how long you hold rates at an elevated or lower level at the end of a rate cycle. You can look at all sorts of statistics around how macro variables evolve during these different cycles and compare across countries, across time, across tightening and easing. Lots of neat stats in the paper. I'm just going to restrain myself and show you two, which are going to be central to the analysis later. One is we look at things on the aggressiveness of rate cycles. So tightening and easing here, each bar is a different long period, about 15 years. Red is the post-pandemic period. And what you see is this is the velocity of our tightening and easing, how much you adjust rates in the first 6 months, how hard you sort of launch the program. And you see the dampening of tightening cycles, less and less aggressive over the first 6 months until the pandemic in red. And then the cycle got more aggressive. And this pattern holds across a lot of variables, even if you move away from nominal to other types of variables. Another set of statistics, which is sort of cool when you've got this combination of what central banks do and the macro variables during these rate cycles, is you can look at things like this. Were central banks slow or to hike rates? So we calculate a principal component of what's going on in macro variables, inflation, output gaps, et cetera. And then when is that first rate hike? And what this shows the index where a lower number means you're early, higher number means you're late. Blue is what these countries do historically from 1970 to 2019. Dark blue is what happened after the pandemic. And this shows just how late central banks were to raise rates after the pandemic, given what was happening in the macroeconomy, particularly the US with their new framework. So there's lots you can say there, but just the main takeaway from this is that central banks were very late to raise rates. A lot of reasons behind that, but much later than historically happens. And again, that'll come back to play in the analysis. Okay, so now we've got great data set of rate cycles, all this information about what central banks do during rate cycles, how that's changed over time, and how macro statistics has evolved. Now we can finally start looking at the trade-offs. And now we're just going to focus on tightening phases when the trade-offs facing central banks tend to be more extreme, especially after supply shocks. So we're going to focus on 3 variables for the first round. We're going to look at inflation reduction, 12-month inflation, focus on headline inflation. Results are the same for core. Look at how much inflation is reduced. Each of these statistics is over each tightening phase for each country. And we're going to look at how much inflation was reduced from its peak to a subsequent trough over each rate cycle, or each tightening phase. We're also going to look at accumulated negative output gaps, ANOGs, over the phase. And then we're going to calculate the sacrifice ratio for each tightening phase, which is calculated the usual way, total output losses accumulated over the whole tightening phase, divided by the reduction in inflation from the peak to trough. And also to take into account the lags of central bank policy, we look over the phase plus over the subsequent 12 months for each of these. So sacrifice ratios. How did sacrifice change over time? This is the medians for our sample of 24 advanced economies over some long windows. What you clearly see is the sacrifice for central banks has fallen quite a bit over time, and particularly after the pandemic. Very low sacrifice from the viewpoint of central banks in terms of adjusting the economy. So why? Why is that sacrifice ratio suddenly so low in response to the post-pandemic high inflation? So if we break down and this pattern also holds for core inflation and for 6 different measures of the output gap. We know it's tricky to measure the output gap. No measures seem to agree at any point in time, but all the patterns I show you are actually consistent across some very different approaches. So back to why did the sacrifice ratio fall so much after the pandemic? So this breaks down the sacrifice ratio into its components. The vertical axis is the numerator, the accumulated negative output gaps. Horizontal axis is the reduction in inflation. You're not supposed to read the codes, but each dot is each country tightening phase, color-coded. So the sort of black and green are earlier tightening phases in the 1970s and 80s. The red is the post-pandemic tightening phase. The US is circled up there in the top. And what you see is where the dots are for the post-pandemic period are a very different spot. They're in another whole range. Traditionally, there's a pretty big trade-off. Like the green line shows traditionally, if you want to reduce inflation a lot, you have a big hit to output, big accumulated output gaps. During the pandemic, though, the line is basically flat. Countries like the US had basically no output losses, but a pretty big inflation reduction. Europe, even larger inflation reduction and only a little bit more of an output loss. So this shows you why you had low sacrifice ratios. It was from both components of the ratio. Really small accumulated output gaps on the top, divided by really big inflation reduction on the bottom. Okay, so you might look at that and say, if you're a central banker, this was a super successful disinflation. We brought inflation down a lot with little costs, record low sacrifice ratios. Haven't seen these before historically. But if you go out and ask the person on the street, they're going to have a very different response. This was not such a successful disinflation. And the main thing missing from all of this sort of analysis, which has been traditionally done, is what happened to the price level. And this is an example from the US of what happened to the price level. The red is what happened to the price level in the US from 1 year before the first rate hike. The yellow dashed line in the middle is what would have happened to the price level if inflation had been 2%. The other lines are what's happened to the price level during other tightening phases. This was a much bigger increase, accumulated increase in the price level over this tightening phase. And even to put it in a longer historical comparison on the right, this was even a bigger increase in the price level than the tightening phases of the 1980s, which were not pain-free. Not quite as big as in the 1970s, but that took a Volcker and a painful recession to then get over. So this is what is really missing, we think, from a lot of the prior analysis. What happens to the price level? And these patterns for the US are shared by other economies. Now looking at the full sample, 24 advanced economies, this is the median for core and headline inflation. And now we look at the excess increase in the price level above 2%. So how much did people have to get used to prices increasing? And we annualize it. So it's per year. So this is sort of what people really have to face. The average in the increase in the price level above 2% inflation was about 4% per year. So that is where this was really painful and a much harder adjustment than anything we've seen, at least since the 80s or 90s. And probably particularly hard given how people weren't used to this. The last few adjustments have been very low increases, excess increases in the price level. We also look at some statistics to get a sense of how the adjustment occurred, how much it occurred through accumulated changes in prices on the top relative to changes in output gaps on the bottom, what we call the price output trade-off ratio. And US on the right, median for the sample on the left, you see during this adjustment, most of the adjustment to the shocks was through prices, not through changes in activity. Okay, so last part of the paper is then, can we explain this? There's obviously a lot that went into this, the nature of the shocks, fiscal policy, a lot of stuff. By now our paper was already getting really long, so we're just going to focus on one set of explanations. Did the central bank strategy matter and affect these trade-offs and these macro outcomes? So we're going to look at some pretty simple regressions, look at these trade-off ratios and macro outcomes as a function of different central bank strategies and a bunch of other stuff, including the shocks hitting the economy, role of oil shocks, et cetera. And in particular, given the time, I'll just show you 2 sets of results. What was the impact of the central bank timing, the fact they were so slow to hike rates this time around? I showed you some pictures. And then what was the impact of the fact they then moved really aggressively? And then I'll also look at the role of central bank credibility, which is getting more attention. So here's a summary of the results. When you look at the impact of central banks being really slow to raise rates after the pandemic, that did lead to a lower sacrifice ratio. Good. It meant actually slightly higher output losses because since they were slow to respond, they did have to hike more aggressively, which meant a little bit more output losses. But the main reason there was less sacrifice was inflation came down a lot. But the main reason inflation came down a lot was there's a huge increase in the price level. And so there was a significant cost of being slow to hike rates, let the price level run up more, which led to what looks like a good sacrifice ratio, but it's mainly because you let inflation go up so much, you could then bring it down a lot. So not clear that was such a great strategy. And those effects are largely significant. What about hiking more aggressively? That did lead to worse sacrifice ratios, mainly because you do get bigger output losses. Some central bankers argued if you hike more aggressively, you're more credible, rates will come, activity will slow faster, or then you won't need to hike as much. That doesn't pan out, but you do get inflation to come down faster. The one policy that has no output or no costs, at least that we look at, that has better trade-offs, central bank credibility corresponds to lower sacrifice ratios, less output losses. You don't have to hike as much. Inflation doesn't fall as much because you don't let the price level go up as much. So the one policy, and we do some estimates of magnitudes, it's amazing the impact of more credible central banks in terms of making the adjustment easier. So lots of caveats. This is super simple correlations, nothing fancy. Endogeneity is an issue we don't control for fiscal policy, lots of other stuff that certainly matter during these adjustments. But the results are actually pretty robust to lots of different approaches, variables, also consistent with, we do some simulations with the Fed's Forbes model that back up these sort of outcomes. So let me just summarize. Lots of neat results in here. Hopefully this is a set of data that you guys can use for lots of other questions. But the bottom line is the central bank strategies do involve trade-offs, costs and benefits of lots of approaches, but the one policy that is pain-free is more credible independent central banks. The results we find do help explain the unusual patterns we saw after the pandemic. The big inflation reduction, small output losses did result from a combination of late start, aggressive response, incredible central banks help get us there. Is the combination, and the magnitudes actually fit okay. But the key thing we hope you take from this paper is that hopefully in the future, we will pay more attention to what happens to the price level during adjustments by central banks. How long inflation deviates from target, by how much, should be part of the discussion. And we don't want that to imply you should do strict price level targeting. When you get shocks like hypothetically big tariffs, you're going to have to do most of the or a lot of the adjustment through prices. But we still think central banks should pay more attention to the price level through things like just talking about it more, modeling the effects, saying if we do this, here's the effect on the price level, and we're going to think about that and adjust their strategies. And we have some sort of clear results on how to think about that. I don't have much time, but I'll just highlight a couple other things we could talk about in the discussion. Is the ECB has been good about using the language the more forceful response when inflation is too low. Maybe we should all talk about being more forceful when you get a larger change in the price level, not just focusing on when inflation is too low, but too high. And for the US, there also is a strong argument to remove some constraints that exist in the current framework that limit central banks' ability to respond when inflation is too high if you haven't met other parts of the mandate. So lots of lessons for today that I'll leave for the discussion. Thank you.